This is Brighter Futures, the film series about how policy can be improved by research and change people's lives. It's my great pleasure to welcome Shane Martin from the Department of Government at the University of Essex. In this episode, we're talking about public and policy engagement with parliaments, looking at the UK, Ireland, and overseas. Shane, tell us a little bit about your research.
Thanks, Jules. Well, I'm a scholar of parliaments, so I study parliaments as part of the wider political system. I look at the relationship between voters, citizens, parliamentarians who are elected by voters, the institution of parliament, how parliament can be more effective, more efficient, play a greater role in oversight of the government, also in representation of voters, and obviously in public policy making. And so,
as you look at those changes, as we sit here in the 2020s, the relationship between the people who put people in Parliament, the voters, the public in general, they shape the policy and change that, which then affects the relationship back with the public in the first place. So how are those two types of relationships changing in the era that we find ourselves in at the moment?
Very much so, and much to the sort of detriment of parliaments as organisations. Parliaments face real challenges in being relevant to the citizens who elect parliamentarians, being relevant to the public policy making process, being relevant to how laws are made, being relevant to how governments are held to account, for example. So parliaments compete with people or groups like the media, for example, to see who can most effectively hold the executive, the Prime Minister, for example, to account. So these are really challenging times for parliaments, like they are for lots of organisations, of course.
And within parliaments, the representation, the types of people who become parliamentarians has been changing. How would you reflect back on recent decades of change of the kinds of people? Obviously, the big changes in some parliaments is over the number of women, for example, who are in senior positions.
Absolutely, and it's been a wonderful change to observe, I have to say. There's a sort of fundamental law, as it were, a social science law in political science, that to have substantive representation, to have the interests of all groups represented in the political system, you have to have descriptive representation. So you have to have the groups. You have to have a parliament that looks like the citizenry that elects it, and that's really important. And what we see in most countries is an increase in the rate of female participation in parliament, so more women parliamentarians, for example, more women in senior positions in parliament, for example. But that's not a universal case. In lots of countries, there are still, women are in real minority, for example. And in recent months, we've looked a lot more to other groups, for example, African Americans in the case of the United States Congress, for example, and the degree to which there's representation of various groups. In the United Kingdom, for example, we're very conscious of class, for example. Our underrepresented groups, such as people who come from lower working class backgrounds, represented appropriately in Parliament? The answer is in the underrepresentation description of them, and the answer is no. And so when we look at class, for example, it's something that pervades so many aspects of society in Britain, and it's an issue in terms of the composition of the House of Commons, and even more so, of course, the House of Lords.
And if we were to see those changes, as you've described, of representation, but also description, the capacity to see people who are like you, where you sit in society. Does that lead to better policy? I mean, it's a big question, obviously, but are we more likely to get policy that is progressive, that influences people's lives in positive ways, rather than just selective few benefiting, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes, with a caveat, and this is really where my engagement work comes to play, I think. You have to empower parliamentarians. So parliamentarians are very busy people. They've typically had a career outside of politics. Now again, that varies from country to country, but most parliamentarians have been private citizens. They haven't grown up in politics necessarily. We do have these phenomena called political dynasties in some country, where if your parent was a politician, you're more likely to be a politician. But most people who enter Parliament don't have a good sense of what it means to be a parliamentarian and what it means to be an effective parliamentarian. And my research is about frequently empowering parliamentarians, and particularly parliamentarians who don't come from backgrounds of politics, how to be as effective and how to be as efficient a parliamentarian. And that feeds into a more effective, more efficient, more powerful Parliament.
And so when you're looking at, you're a professor of comparative government, so if you're looking at different countries, particularly Ireland and the UK, if we take two close to home, what sorts of major differences do we see in that kind of representation, that strength of parliamentarians, the hopes that they have to improve policy in that sense?
Well, one really good example, I think, is the budgetary process. The role of parliamentarians in making a national budget, for example. Budgets are primarily financial documents. They can be really tough for lay people, non-finance people to engage with. So some of the projects I work on, for example, is sort of providing training to parliamentarians and how to engage in the budgetary process as efficiently and as effectively as possible, so that it's not the case of you have a MP, in the case of the House of Commons, for example, versus the entire bureaucracy of the British civil servants.
And so does that training work? I mean, does it help to understand how, in that sense, it's financial information, but how information is laid out in front of you and how you could interrogate that, ask questions of it, and I suppose become a researcher, an action researcher, because you're trying to find something out and trying to do something about it. So we're transferring some of those skills.
Yes, so one of the things we always do with any project we engage in is to look at the efficiency, or look at the effectiveness, of the actual project. And particularly when an organisation such as a parliament, as a public body, is paying for that translational research, they want to understand the actual impact of that project on the organisation of the Parliament and ultimately on the production of public policy. Parliamentarians are busy people. Their first priority, we know, is to stay in office. Their second priority is to get elected, perhaps get promoted. So just like a career in any organisation, you have to sell to parliamentarians why this is in their interest, why it's in their interest to actually attend training sessions on the budgetary process, to engage in legislation that perhaps their constituents back home don't particularly care about, but actually for the law to be as good as it can be, parliamentarians need to be involved in the lawmaking process.
So there's a kind of element of storytelling in that as well. There's that, having learnt that, they've got to be able to turn in another direction and talk to their constituents and say, this is what I've been doing to improve your lives. And is that also something that's important?
Absolutely. And I think regardless of what country you are working in, what you always see is a desire for parliamentarians to engage with their constituents. Now, what a constituent means varies from country to country, of course, and how they engage. So in a lot of African countries I worked in, for example, they have constituency development funds. And these constituency development funds are pockets of money given to a parliamentarian to allocate as the parliamentarian sees fit, for example. That doesn't happen in the United Kingdom or Ireland, for example, but MPs in Great Britain do return to their constituencies at the weekend or on a Friday and do spend a lot of time engaging with their constituents and providing direct services to their constituents.
So could you tell us a little bit about your work in Southern Africa then? Because it may well be there's an assumption that other countries can learn from those countries that have had parliaments for a longer period of time. But it could easily be the other way around as you develop new forms of representation, new types of democracy, and maybe these kind of funds get spent in a way that increases people's engagement as constituents. Maybe there are lessons to be learned from lots of different places.
Well, certainly for me, one of the highlights of my career has been involving myself in Southern African parliaments. And this was a project funded by what was then the Department for International Development here in the United Kingdom. And it involved having essentially 3 or 4 day seminars with senior parliamentary officials, the equivalent of presiding officer or speaker, senior parliamentarians from a group of parliaments around Southern Africa, coming to Johannesburg as it happened, and actually going through a process of understanding how parliaments can be more effective in the national budgetary process, how they can be holding the finance department to account, what role they should be playing, what does constitute best practice from an international perspective in terms of involving individual parliamentarians and Parliament as an institution in the budgetary process.
And so, if you were stepping back from that, the pathway for those parliaments in Southern Africa is going to differ slightly amongst those countries. Is there the possibility then that they would innovate in ways that countries of Europe or North America might say, well, that's very interesting, we could be learning lessons from how that's worked to improve our systems? In other words, the rising tide raises all ships.
Absolutely. Parliaments in Europe are just as challenged, for want of a better term, as legislatures or assemblies anywhere in the world. So there are absolutely lessons to be learned. All too often, I think, the learning process involves looking across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C. But the US system of politics, of course, is very different. So we often have more in common with countries in South America or in Africa than we do with the United States political system, given the divide between the President and the United States Congress. And the resourcing available to the United States Congress, of course, is at a level that is just unheard of in Europe.
Completely different, yeah. So, fascinating. So if you were to just step back a bit and say, what would be your kind of couple of key hopes or priorities when it comes to parliaments and politics as you look forward from here?
Well, I really like the Norwegian model, and I've had an opportunity to spend some time at various stages in Norway. And what strikes me about the Norwegian government, in the narrow sense of the senior politicians and the civil service and the wider bureaucracy, is that in Norway there's a shared understanding that good public policy that is in the interest of the everyday citizen, requires Parliament to be fully engaged in oversight, in ensuring transparency, in accountability, in lawmaking. And that's something you don't get in a lot of European countries. You get this sort of, as it were, a battle or a fight between the executive, between the Prime Minister, their cabinet, and Parliament. And it's a conflictual relationship often. If you want good public policy, if you want good governance, you have to have a strong Parliament. And that requires an institution that is efficient and effective.
Shane Martin, thank you very much indeed. You've been watching an episode of Brighter Futures. If you'd like to hear more conversations about how ideas improve lives, then pop along to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.